So today we're going to take a look at what U.S. interests are in that part of the world and how to best advance them. First of all, what are the American interests? Surely it's more than opposing al-Qaeda and stability. That's what we had under the dictators. I would argue that in addition to preserving the peace treaty with Israel and advancing our other security and economic interests, the United States also has an interest in seeing that human rights are observed. That would mean the equality of women under the law, and also very important, a bedrock principle for the United States and also an international freedom is religious freedom. And Egypt is home to the largest non-Muslim community in the Middle East, that is the Coptic Orthodox. But it's not just the Christians, it's also those who are cultural Muslims who may have different views than Islamists. There's the Quranists, there's other Shiite Muslims, Sufi Muslims, the Baha'is, there are Jews. So how do we advance these interests in protecting human rights, in protecting our security and trade interests, and preserving the peace with Israel, both in the short term and the long term? How do we engage in the elections that are coming up? In the Cold War period, we would fund and train liberal Democrats in Europe. In recent years, we've had a more hands-off approach, either training and funding all parties indiscriminately, not looking at ideology as we did in Iraq in 2005, or possibly not getting engaged at all in the elections coming up. Should we be training, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Mubarak sub-party members? Do they need training? Will they get funding from abroad? Will Iran and Saudi Arabia be likely to be trying to compete with each other to have influence with those groups? And then after the election, we need to consider the fact that Egypt is one of America's largest military and foreign aid recipients. Should we continue that? And if so, should we have conditions on our aid? So with that setting up the debate or the discussion, I'd like to turn to introducing our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Hedia Miramati. She's a lawyer who has served as legal counsel and consultant to a wide range of clients and traveled extensively to learn about the methodology, ideology, infrastructure, and recruiting techniques of Islamist extremist movements. And she is president of WORD, which is a non-governmental educational institute that instructs in civic engagement to communities. She serves on the Los Angeles Police Department's Community Police Advisory Board and is active member of the Director of National Intelligence Heritage Council. In addition, as the co-chair of the first ever all-female Islamic Law Council, she works with other influential Muslim women to re-examine the current standing of Islamic jurisprudence on a wide variety of issues. Her previous political appointment was to the U.S. Embassy of Afghanistan as senior advisor for civil society infrastructure. And she is the author of many monographs, notably A Community-Based Approach to Countering Radicalization, a Partnership for America. Our second speaker is Ed Hussein, who is a senior fellow this year at the Council on Foreign Relations. And his work also focuses on international threats from radicalization, extremism, and terrorism. And he was one of the co-founders and co-directors of Quilliam, which is the world's first counter-radicalization think tank in London. He was formerly an activist with a number of Islamist groups in the UK, including Muslim Brotherhood Front organizations. And he is the author of the famous book, The Islamist. Our final speaker is my colleague, Hillel Fratkin, and Dr. Fratkin is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute, where he directs the Center on Islam, Democracy, and the Future of the Muslim World. And he is co-founder of the Current Trends in Islamist Ideology, the leading journal on contemporary Islamism, which he co-edits. He has written widely, and I think you all have a copy of his latest article with Scooter Libby in Commentary magazine entitled Egypt's Islamists, A Cautionary Tale. Hillel received his degree in Islamic Studies from the University of Chicago for work done under the direction of the late Pakistani theologian Fazlur Rahman. So without further ado, I'm going to ask you to welcome our panelists, and then Hadi will start. Please turn off all your cell phones. Thank you. We'll have time also for question and answers after everyone presents.
Thank you, Nina, and thank you, Hudson Institute, for having us here today. Well, the events unfolding across the Middle East invoke these powerful feelings of great hope for the people of these nations. But as Nina mentioned, we have the reality of a new generation of Islamism in nations across the world. Unfortunately, similar revolutions in countries like Iran, Lebanon, and even the invasion in Iraq and Afghanistan have brought with them varying degrees of pseudo-religious law, which only further stifles the people and destroys their dreams of personal dignity and freedom. The end of a dictatorship and the creation of a democratic electoral system do not automatically lead to the development of a liberal democracy that fosters a free society. In fact, Turkey and Indonesia are textbook examples of how Islamists can empower themselves through elections and push forward reforms that Islamicize the country's law and its people. The Prosperous Justice Party of Indonesia is constantly challenging the secular establishment for more conservative policies for everything from public drinking to punishments for crimes. Most would say the same for Turkey's AK party. Ironically, their efforts can hamper human rights just as much as dictatorships have repressed people in Egypt or Saudi Arabia. Because the U.S. often views these Islamists as the only players in town, our democracy promotion debate often stagnates on whether or not the U.S. government should interact directly with these groups. Unfortunately, I think we're missing the mark entirely. Regardless of whether the U.S. engages these groups directly or not, the Islamists will implement their agenda. Hamas, Hezbollah, and the transnational Wahhabi network of Saudi Arabia have not increased or decreased in power because of a USG interaction or lack thereof. Upon careful analysis, I found that the presence of draconian Islamist law is more a function of how these parties are able to influence or socially engineer their own populace rather than whether they had a meeting at the White House. Therefore, when the U.S. advocates democracy promotion, we have to carefully consider how do we frame the discussion. I hope it isn't too radical a statement, but I don't think interacting with Islamists is the major problem or the solution. It's our failure to interact with their opposition, the liberal and cultural movements of these countries, which has been our major policy failure to date. Unless we start to empower the political and social movements in Muslim countries that share our values, we will continue to see the oppressive Islamist groups coming to the forefront. In my personal experience in Afghanistan, congressionally funded democracy promotion organizations could only provide training to political parties that were formally organized, which meant only the Islamist parties. I assume this may still be the case, but what we need to be doing is providing alternative leaders with the requisite training to start new political parties and to teach them how they can effectively message to their constituents. We should also be providing them with training in media skills, communications development, social networking, and grassroots campaigning. Without competition from liberal or modern alternative narratives, the Islamists have a tremendous advantage to change the way their societies perceive Islam and its role in their society. It's important to recognize that much of their support from the populace does not come from promoting a religious doctrine, but rather coalesces around the issues of social services, equality, and welfare. To create healthy competition, we should focus our U.S. foreign policy, our financial, intellectual, and social capital toward empowering the political and social movements in Muslim countries that share our values. We need to go beyond just engaging alternative groups. We need to ensure these newly freed communities have access to the fundamental principles that shape a free society. Notions like free speech, societal pluralism, and what it means to be civically engaged. This could mean major educational initiatives like we used to run through USIA, where we translate and disseminate seminal works on democracy. We need to rebuild libraries that we used to have in these countries and resource centers where these works would be widely available and generate discussion on the adaptability to the local context. The political and social voices that disagree with the Islamists need access to the public square and ways to define their platform to set themselves apart from their competition. By elevating the status of groups that share our values as Americans, we can tailor democracy promotion to avoid empowering the Islamists. I am saddened to say that many Americans are not familiar with what these shared values may be, so I'd like to run through a few of them. For example, it's a commitment to religious freedom of all persons, including Muslims of other denominations, and the freedom of religious expression, whatever that may be. Second, it is to practice and to promote nonviolence in conflict resolution. And for Muslims, what this practically means is to absolutely reject the centrality of militant jihad to Islamic practices. Though radical Islamists have monopolized the definition of jihad to mean violence against adversaries, the rules of military combat in traditional mainstream Islam are very strict and only require state-to-state actors. We need to work with partners who are vocal and committed to denouncing militant jihad, either at home or abroad, in countries like Afghanistan, Iraq, or Somalia. Third is respect for the rule of law and its ability to provide social justice. For Muslims, this means rejecting the call to transform state laws into extreme religious laws and to adhere to a country's secular legal framework, which is most important, that it be capable of resolving disputes and administering social services effectively. Finally, it means respecting gender equality, allowing women to participate in government, even the highest levels of government, the business sector, and education. And I don't mean relegating women to roles that are only done traditionally by women. It is important for the U.S. government, civil society funding, and our public diplomacy outreach to be governed not by what we think is popular, but what we believe to be universal human values. These values not only serve our democracy promotion interests, but they pose a direct challenge to the recruitment and ideology of Islamists who brainwash youth into believing that their only way to address social and political grievances is to place themselves in opposition to the West. Identifying groups that uphold the values I outlined will help us build partners on the ground that share our vision for the future of the world. We have to keep in mind that finding alternative voices is complicated and time-consuming. Therefore, the U.S. government should consider investing in projects that identify these potential partners and the credible voices of people who share our values. Unfortunately, a lot of our contacts to date, either through the embassies or through NGOs, don't have such a criteria, so they may not be the best fit. We need to expand our resources in academia and the private sector to research these potential groups on the ground. So the question on everyone's mind today is, what will the U.S. do in response to a changing Middle East? But what I wish we would have asked was how we could have prepared these societies better for the change. I think our failure to direct foreign aid and diplomacy toward the values and norms we cherish has resulted in immature and in some places non-existent civil society infrastructure for Muslims. I also think that failure will lead to the well-organized, disciplined societal infrastructure of the Islamists to have an overwhelming influence. If the Islamists are to prevail, their culture of hatred and belligerence toward the West, their oppression of women, and the imposition of draconian religious law will be a grave tragedy for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Hen.
Nina, thank you very much. Can I also say that it's an honor to be here speaking at Hudson and also on this panel with Hilal, Hadia and Nina. I was thinking or contemplating moving to the US, I think, in the summer of last year, and I'm grateful to Hudson at that time for being of immense support, generosity and advice, and that stays with me to this day. But that said, I just want to sort of mark out a couple of things, and that is, I've just returned from Cairo. I was in Cairo all of last week meeting with Muslim Brotherhood people, And I went to Cairo not because I didn't know what the Brotherhood stood for. I was exposed to the Brotherhood in my youth, but also because I think what happened in Tahrir Square or the revolution in Egypt changed the dynamics on the ground. And I had in my mind at least no doubt that this would change the Muslim Brotherhood. And I wrote a piece in the Financial Times, I think on the 11th of February, highlighting 3 or 4 areas that the Brotherhood was not clear in terms of where they stood. And in response to that piece, I got invitations from people in Cairo to come and speak to people involved with the Brotherhood, and I took that invitation. And looking back, I'm pleased I went, because some of my views as a result of interacting with the Brotherhood have changed. And I'll tell you why and how. Who did I meet? I met people from across the spectrum in the Brotherhood, and I want to make this point firmly, that there is no one Muslim Brotherhood. There are various brotherhoods within the Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is not a monolithic Islamic movement, but it's a social network that represents various strands of Islamic thinking. So from Salafis and even some Sufis to those who are ultra-modernists to those who are die-hard conservatives, all fit within a Muslim Brotherhood network that is based on an emotional veneration of their founder, Hassan al-Banna, and protesting against the status quo in Egypt, at least up until very recently. That then leads me to making the point that there are various Islamisms, and there isn't one Islamism. Yes, Islamism is essentially an anti-Western protest movement, and yes, essentially most forms of Islamism want to see Sharia as law in some form or another, but I think we'd be doing ourselves, and by extension US foreign policy, a disservice if we try to reduce a complex phenomenon to just 1 or 2 things. Inside the Brotherhood, it was difficult at times getting meetings because of my public criticism of the Brotherhood over the last sort of 3 to 4 years, but I was given access to people who are at the Al-Azhar Institute or the Al-Azhar University, one of the oldest surviving universities in the world, and the leading Sunni theological institute, and leaders of the Brotherhood there. I also spoke in depth with Mehdi Akif, the former leader of the Brotherhood, still very popular with the grassroots. I also spoke with those revolutionary individuals, such as, I don't want to mention names actually at this stage, but people who are involved in the Tahrir Square revolutionary movement, and people who were shot and left for dead. Had the honor of meeting them. Also met with the parliamentary bloc, or several leaders from the parliamentary bloc at least. So I think say, and also those people who recently left the Brotherhood. I think I can fairly say that I've tried to meet as many people from as varied strands within the Brotherhood as possible. Now, in those discussions, and referring back to my previous point about various Islamisms, it's fair then to say that Islamist projects have failed in countries such as Sudan, in Afghanistan, and Iran. But Islamist projects are an experiment in Turkey today, and possibly in Tunisia, and I think possibly in Egypt. And then to respond to the question of today's discussion, how should the US government respond to the rise of prospective Islamist governments? I think the test falls on 3 or 4 areas. The first area as to how we determine whether an Islamist government in Egypt is one that can be interacted with, engaged with, supported or not, is determined by its attitude towards Sharia. What do Egyptian Islamists, in this case the Muslim Brotherhood, mean by Sharia law? And I repeatedly asked this question across the spectrum of the Brotherhood, and I got mixed answers. And mixed answers, I think at least, are a good thing. In other words, they don't have a clear, decisive view, unlike other Islamist governments, as to what Islamist organizations, rather, for example, Hizb ut-Tahrir, as to what exactly the Brotherhood wants. And therefore, I think they're open to being molded, shaped via an NGO, non-government, non-US government interaction, rather than being written off as these people are inherently problematic. The second area, and on this issue of Sharia, it's worth saying that the Muslim Brotherhood has gone out of his way, at least Muhammad Badi' has, to say he doesn't believe in introducing Sharia law, or he doesn't believe in Egypt becoming an Islamic state, but a civil state. As a result, he's been out-Islammed, if you like, by those on the right of the Brotherhood, Salafis and others who've said, no, we want an Islamic state. So there's a live debate going on inside the Brotherhood as to what an Islamic state or a Sharia-based state means. And the Brotherhood is at the helm of this discussion, and there are people inside the Brotherhood who have gone out of the way to say, we don't want to see hudud punishment, we don't want to see discrimination against women, we're happy to see Copts as leaders of this country, we're happy to be led by women. There are those who've opposed all of that. So again, an indication that the debate and the jury's out. So Sharia as law is one issue. The second issue, and Nina touched on this, is human rights. And I'm more interested in the rule of law than human rights. In other words, if a Coptic Christian or if any minority group is discriminated against under a new Egyptian government in months and years to come, what recourse do they have beyond having access to a powerful individual or good relations with the mayor of a given city? So in other words, how does the system, how does the rule of law come to their aid without discrimination and with free and fair trial and punishment meted out as and when appropriate? And again, on this question, I found most people within the Brotherhood to be on the right side of the debate, that they were very keen on understanding the rule of law, and they were very keen on advancing human rights as understood broadly within the West, with one or two exceptions vis-a-vis social conservative issues, and in that they're no different actually from the various Christian right-wing movements, whether here or in Europe. The third issue is that of Israel, and recognizing A, the state of Israel as a Jewish democratic state, and B, recognizing its legitimacy to exist in till the day of judgment or whatever, indefinitely. And here, this is where the problem arises, in that the Muslim Brotherhood across the board, sadly, fail this test. Everyone I've approached on the question of Hamas, suicide bombing, support for legitimizing Israel's existence as a Jewish democratic neighbor, there are serious reservations among most members of the Brotherhood on how this happens. Some of them came out openly in support of suicide bombings. Some of them did not recognize Israel full stop and thought it should be done away with. That said, there were others like Mohammed Beltaji, the Secretary General of the Parliamentary Bloc, who went out of his way to say, we don't believe in what Ahmadinejad believed, in other words, destroying Israel or removing it from the map. So there were positive signs. So again, the jury's out on the question of Israel, but all of them, without fail, said that they had issues with Israel, but they would honor the Camp David Agreement. And I thought that was indicative that they would honor it. Whether it's short-term strategizing, we don't know, but that was the response. I don't want to go on too long. I want to just say two things in conclusion, and that is that of the various strands of the Brotherhood that I met and that exist out there, I think the hope emanates from two strands. And I hate this word, engage, but I believe in interacting with those two strands by way of advice, access, patronage, where necessary, non-governmental funding, in order to get these guys, these two strands, and I'll tell you what these two strands are in a moment, to change the terms of the debate within the Muslim Brotherhood, from the Brotherhood being focused on America hating or Israel bashing. None of these two slogans will result in the kind of issues that the revolutionaries wanted to see. To get those two groups to move the terms of the debate to what ordinary Egyptians want and what most members of the Brotherhood want, which is the basic issues of jobs, housing, education, and healthcare. Those are the issues on which parliamentarians have been fighting in Egypt, and I think the two blocks within the Brotherhood that are most receptive to shifting the terms of the debate from obsession with Sharia to dealing with key issues, these two blocks are first the urban, educated, young members of the Muslim Brotherhood, both male and female, not the suburban, less educated, mass membership of the Brotherhood. Those are the ordinary flock who will respond to the call of the urban, connected, educated, young members of the Brotherhood, mostly under the age of 42, 43 downwards. I choose 43 because Beltaji is 43 years old. So that age downward. And I've met those individuals and their cause for hope. Even on the issue of Israel, they passed tests, except on the question of suicide bombing. We'll come to that in a moment. And the other key block are the parliamentarians. Under the last parliament, Egypt had 88 parliamentarians. In a future parliament, they may well have higher number. And because the parliamentarians have to return to their electorate on a 4-year basis, because the parliamentarians are accountable for those 4 issues of houses, jobs, healthcare, and education, they're more interested. And they're not particularly interested in Sharia or Hudud and all the rest of it from the meetings I've had with them. And I think the hope is, with these two key constituencies within the Brotherhood, to reshape the debate within the Muslim Brotherhood and by extension the wider region and Islamism globally. And I think, and forgive me for being the optimism, I think it can be done. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you.
I want to first begin by thanking Nina for organizing this panel. It's obviously about a most important subject, and I trust we will have an important discussion about it. I take it the topic of this panel was framed generally, but I take it we're going to wind up speaking largely about Egypt and the case of Egypt as perhaps the most prominent example of the issue and the most important country that may be affected by it. And I guess there are two. So there's going to be two questions involved here. One is an assessment of Egypt itself, and the situation in Egypt, especially with the Muslim Brotherhood, which was just provided by Ed Hussein. And then there's the question. Then there's the question of what we do, that is to say, the United States. I'd like to say a few things about the latter first, and then come to the issue of what is to make of Egypt's present and future. I think but I can begin with Egypt by saying simply that Egypt and all other Middle Eastern countries are sovereign countries. We respect their sovereignty. And in fact, the United States is frequently called upon to defend the sovereignty of Middle Eastern countries. The most notable example was in the Gulf War of 1991, where we came to the defense of the sovereignty of Kuwait. On the other hand, as Nina mentioned at the outset, we do have interests in the region, and we have our own right to see to those interests, especially, and this gets into another aspect of the question that Nina raised, especially when people ask for our help. We have some right to intrude our interests into this matter. And this, it seems to me, leads to two broad principles, which should, I think, really be kept in mind in this or any other discussion. The people of each country in the world, and certainly in the Middle East, and especially under the present circumstances of turmoil and revolt, will decide how they want to be governed. We are occasionally in a position to affect that decision. We are occasionally in a position to affect who comes to, in some measure, who comes to rule. But on the whole, that's not really the case. We are obliged to, or at least have to make do with, what the decisions that people make in their own countries. On the other hand, we're not obliged to respect every party to governance, and we're not. I would add, it is also not our job to offer, to show that we offer respect to every party to governance, unless they show that they deserve it by our lights of what just deserts for respect are. And that leads, I think, to how one, in more specific ways, what our questions are with respect to the present situation. On the one hand, the question is, what kinds of governance, of new forms of regime will emerge in these countries, especially in Egypt? And we have to make some, and we should make some rather clear distinctions, at least for clarity's sake. Are they going to be democratic? Are they going to be liberal democratic? I believe there is such a category as liberal authoritarian. Fareed Zakaria has made that popular. Or are they somehow in between in some way, and just we'll call them representative of somehow of the groups within society? So we should ask ourselves at the outset, what are the likely possibilities in the situation, and what's our preference? I would say that in general our preference is going to be liberal democratic, but there's going to be in many situations a likelihood that kind of governance is not going to exist. And then but having some clarity about what we'd like to see, we can ask ourselves look at the groups on the ground and say, which groups are most likely to contribute to that end? Both a regime we would like to see and a regime that would be favorable, as Nina said earlier, to interests that we regard as important. If we're going to provide any kind of real assistance. And by the way, assistance may not be asked for and not welcome. So how does that apply to the situation as we face in Egypt today? Ed has put before us, and other people have as well, the hope that there is hope should be placed in the prospect of the involvement of the Muslim Brotherhood in future governance. There's a very strong temptation to do that because they are a powerful force. They are a large group. And at the moment, as one could see from the referendum that took place over the weekend, an extremely influential group. It is largely through their campaigning that the referendum passed with a very, very substantial vote. They were both energetic and, if I may say so, misleading about the character of the referendum and what was involved in it. And the two together secured a vote of something like 75% for the constitutional amendments. So that's a brute fact. The Brotherhood is an important organization in Egypt. What does that have to do with us? I mean, what is it that we are obliged to do, and how are we to assess it? Now, Ed has said that there are a variety of brotherhoods. Undoubtedly, there are. There's always a distinction between the old and young in whatever organization you have. And there's an organization large enough to, as the Brotherhood is, will undoubtedly contain a variety of different groups within it. But organizations that have any real impact always have some unity of purpose. And they also have leaders who provide that unity until such time as they fail to command it. Now, at the present time, there is a leadership of the Brotherhood, and by and large, it's still respected, even by younger members of the Brotherhood. At least one would have to say they are still following its direction. And I would like to cite a couple of remarks by a member of the Guidance Bureau, which is the sort of governing body of the Brotherhood, apart from the Supreme Guide himself. And in particular, man Esem Al-Aryan, who is considered to be a spokesman for the more open-minded side of the Brotherhood. Prior to earlier, let's say, in the events, especially prior to the fall of Mubarak, Esem Al-Aryan was quoted, I believe he actually wrote an article which said as follows: "We come with no special agenda of our own. Our agenda is that of the Egyptian people. We aim to achieve reform and rights for all, not just for the Muslim Brotherhood and not just for Muslims, but for all Egyptians." That, I think, was extremely well received as a statement of a kind of hopeful, open Brotherhood attitude towards the new political process. In today's New York Times, an article that Nina referred to, in the aftermath of the referendum and the successful Muslim Brotherhood campaign, Mr. Aryan Um, it says as follows. He says partially something that reflects the earlier remarks and something that doesn't. Nothing has changed, he told his interviewer. We are keen to spread our ideas and our values. We are not keen for power. However, he went on to say, don't trust the intellectuals, liberals, and seculars. They are a minor group crying all the time. If they don't work hard, they have no future. Well, that's perfectly true. If they don't work hard, they have no future. But let's put it this way. He would not be terribly disappointed if they didn't have have a real future. And that means that I think in the short term, one can expect to see the Muslim Brotherhood working for the kind of political process and regime that Hajj Miramati was describing before. Well, where does that leave us? We have ultimately no say in the matter in Egypt. If the Egyptian people want to give a prominent role to the Brotherhood, and the political process operates in such a way as to make that available to them, they will. But it seems to me that we are not. It's not our job to push that ahead. Nor do I think, as Ed suggested, that we're in a position particularly to shape how that process goes, at least from the point of view of the Brotherhood. We speak with no authority with respect to Islam as such. We speak with no authority as former members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Ed may be able to, but I can't, and nor do American officials. What we can do...
You're respectable.
I was, but Fazlur himself was driven out of Pakistan by the sister organization of the Muslim Brotherhood. So I would say that that leaves us with, I think, a very limited role to play, and that role is something along the lines that Hedja suggested, which is to try to provide some assistance to the alternative parties within Egypt. But even there, it seems to me that there has to be real energy shown by those parties within Egypt. I mean, Mr. Arian is right. If they don't work hard,
No
we
future.
can't make them work hard, and we can't help them work hard. I think, and this is where I'll conclude. There's Hedja used the phrase "we should," "we need," "we must," "we do" several times in remarks. We all do this, and I don't mean Muslim activists like Hedja, but all Americans do when we talk about our government. I think we do this a bit too much. It is a principle of it's the foundation of the kinds of governance we're talking about as desirable, that they arise from the desire and capacity of people to govern for themselves, do for themselves. There is too much of a presumption in many parts of the world, but especially in the Middle East, that America has to provide for, has to make available to. We can provide assistance, but we have the capacity to, we have the experience, we have the power, we have the wealth, but it really is up to the people of the region to work hard in their own behalf. And I would say, there may become an argument for there may be an argument ultimately for us doing very little in these circumstances and seeing what transpires. If, for example, there comes to be a strongly Islamist government in Egypt, we will have to live with it. We will have relations with it, but we do not have to encourage it, and there's very little we can do apart from providing some assistance to the alternative parties to make their way. Thank you.
Thank you all. We will now turn to our audience for questions. And Hillel, I just want to mention that you quoted from Mr. El Arian of the Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, top leader, and I noted that Stratfor, the strategy intelligence news service, recently had a quote by him as well about the peace treaty with Israel and about Egypt's future relations with Israel, were the Muslim Brotherhood to come to power. And he said, quote, "It's up to the Egyptian people. We can make a future referendum on peace with Israel. Israelis have nothing to fear except the crimes they perpetrate." And specifically about the peace treaty, he says it needs a revision.
Yeah.
So
Let me say something about this issue and maybe some of the other litmus tests that Ed applied in his recent trip. The peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, it somehow, first of all, it's obviously important. It's important that it be preserved, but to whom is it important? Well, it's important to the Israelis. They would prefer peace rather than war, and that's actually very powerfully true in Israel, almost at all times, and certainly now. It's important to the United States as an ally of Israel, and one which, like in the case of Kuwait in 1991, has a concern with the sovereignty of another state in the region, which is Israel, and in general would prefer to see the region not erupt in a general war, both for Israel's sake, for our sake, and for the region's sake. The other people, the other party for whom the peace would be good is the Egyptians. The Egyptian people, the Egyptian army, have profited very much from 30 years of peace. The Egyptian army in particular knows this. And I want to stress that it's been, this aspect of the matter, because sometimes it's somehow considered to be that the peace treaty was some gift of Egypt to Israel. It was a gift of Egypt to itself, a gift that was made by a truly impressive statesman, Anwar Sadat, who realized that the struggle with Israel, the struggle to destroy Israel, was doing much more harm to Egypt than it was to Israel. And not only in terms of the material losses of men and money and successive wars, but in the fact that through these wars, Egypt became to be effectively a colony of the Soviet Union. Having escaped one colonial master, Britain, it wound up under another. That the obsession with Israel was as much, if not worse, for Egypt. Now, I think that was a correct assessment. I think the 30 years of peace have borne that out. And there are two, I think, real dangers in the present situation. One of them is for Egypt and perhaps for other countries in the Middle East and the region as a whole, and that is to become once again absorbed and obsessed with the question of Israel and the question of its destruction, because it will be, even if Israel is ultimately destroyed, it will be self-destructive of the countries that engage in it. That to the extent that, and by the way, this will also, it will be self-destructive because, not only because it will lead to a war, but because the societies in question, societies that have a new opportunity to build a different kind of future, will forego that chance. They will not spend their time trying to figure out how they're going to govern themselves after 30 years or 50 years or 60 years in the case of Egypt of authoritarian rule, but how they can go to war again. And that will be very, very destructive.
Okay, now we'll turn to our questions. I ask you to speak into the microphone, hold it very close to your mouth because we're streaming live on our website and there are a lot of internet viewers, I know. Okay, over this side. And please identify yourself and again, speak into the microphone because you will not be heard on the internet if you don't speak in. Close.
Yeah, first of all, I'm a cop. We have to either not trust, also they are trying to paint, the exact same rosy picture for themselves. Now, we have, Muhammad here, the current Supreme Guide, who is a very sharp person. We have also previous Supreme Guide, who was a very blunt. But whether blunt or sharp, they share the ultimate goal, and that is to grab the power and rule Egypt. And once they have, Khalil said that if they grab the power, we have to deal with the alternatives. Sir, if they grab the power, there will be no alternative left. Look at Hamas and look at Gaza. They will not allow anybody, even to raise his head rather than to share, the power. Okay. So Ed also said that Muslims, not all brotherhood. We have, Shia, we have, this sex and that sex and so on. Well, let me, and I'm sure, you have it, clear in mind, but let me clarify. Okay. Mahdi Akif said it. He said, the three famous toes. For those who don't know what toes means, it means, the hell with. Okay? And he said, toes hell with Egypt and the Egyptians. He said, I would rather have some Muslim from Indonesia or Malaysia to rule Egypt rather than to have an Egyptian Copt to be the president of this country. So that is their attitude, in general. Okay, nowadays they are trying, and of course, because this is the name of the game. They are trying, to paint, themselves, as even secular, to the extent that they deceived, our own vice president, Mr. Biden, called them, a secular organization. Well, Mr. Biden and everybody, if you think, they are secular, it's enough, just to look at first of all to their name, not mean, they are secular at all, and also their slogan. Their slogan is very well known, and that, summarizes their intents and their goals. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Did anyone want to respond to that? Or?
Yeah, I'll respond since I've been.
And I just want to say, with all fairness to Mr. Biden, that dumb remark was made actually by Mr. Clapper, the director of national intelligence, and he later retracted it.
I worry when once the whole sort of revolutionary fervor had broken out, I did lots of interviews with Fox News of all people. And one of the things that repeatedly came out is, isn't the Muslim Brotherhood Al-Qaeda? Isn't the Muslim Brotherhood Al-Qaeda? Well, no, it isn't. And I'm sorry to the gentleman who thinks that the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power would somehow end rights for minorities, and particularly Copts. You speak to the leadership of the Copts, whether it's Baba Shanouda or others, they seem to have a very different view of the Muslim Brotherhood. And even those who are on the right of the Brotherhood, Muhammad Hassan, who's a big shot Salafi preacher, very popular, and I was shocked this time round on my trip that there were people in various parts of Egypt who would see him or want to see him as president, or would vote for him at least. He's much more on the right wing of the Brotherhood, by the way, and he turned up in Alexandria recently when the church was attacked, and there's a greater degree, I think, of solidarity even with the Salafi Muslims and at least that particular Coptic community. And I just worry that when too often here in Washington we have this situation where fear is used to inject into the minds of Western policymakers, Washingtonians in particular, that somehow Islamists coming to power, again a monolithic term without understanding the various nuances, ultimately always means bad news for either the West or for minorities in those countries or for the majorities in those countries. I mean, we can get into the business of quoting and counter-quoting. You can quote me Akif, I can quote you Badi. We can get into this business, but ultimately what matters is what's happening on the ground, the debates within the Brotherhood, and those debates are alive and well. I mean, I witnessed them last week. I urge you to go and do that. And the last point I would make is this, that I said this in my talk and I say it again, that there are various Islamisms and there are various brotherhoods. And those aren't just divided by age and demographics and educational levels and what have you, but they're divided along lines of ideas and visions, different visions for the future based on different ideas. And that said, the last example I'd put to you is, look at someone like Rashid Ghanouchi, the leader of the Ennahda party in Tunisia. In a recent interview, he came out without any caveat and said the understanding of the Islamic State or a khilafah or something ruled by Sharia is an Islamic understanding of the past. In other words, it's redundant today. Even on questions of popular sovereignty, on women being leaders of a state, someone like Ghanouchi is ahead. Even nudist beaches. And he's come out and said if people in Tunisia want nudist beaches, good luck to them. Now, I mean, if that's still an Islamist, I'm sorry, but the point I'm trying to make is that there are various Islamisms and we shouldn't exaggerate the fear and the threat. But at the same time, we ought to be aware that there are genuinely Islamist radical organizations that are more problematic, and it's just understanding the nuances and who's who rather than going in with our bulldozers and then realizing that the situation on the ground is actually radically different from what we're often told here in Washington.
Well,
I want to say something about this. Ed, this is really not fair. It's not fair because people don't make the confusions in this town that you described. They don't confuse Al-Qaeda with the Muslim Brotherhood. They know that they're different, and there's a kind of argument that's made all the time to suggest that people for the last 9 years have been operating in complete ignorance. Perhaps that's partially confirmed by the director of our national intelligence when he talks about the Muslim Brotherhood as a secular organization. But that's the opposite of the kind of confusion you're talking about. And secondly, fear is not the worst kind of stance to approach new things with, or at least anxiety. We teach our children to entertain some kinds of anxiety or fear about new things because they're likely to hurt themselves with it if they don't have some. And what we're facing here is a new situation, a very new situation. It's a new situation for us, it's a new situation for Egypt, it's a new situation for the Brotherhood. The fact that it is a new situation for the Brotherhood means that there is the possibility of what you described, that it will, that there's a lot going on inside of it, that there's a lot that could happen with it, and so forth. It remains, however, the case that it has a history, and it before we accord it a new view or adopt a new view of what it's like. It's for it to show its bona fides. That's why I quoted Mr. El-Arian. For me, his bona fides are now suspect. He talked one way before Mubarak was gone, and he talks one way afterward. And after the Brotherhood has shown its power. That's not just, that's a fact. I'm interpreting it one way, perhaps incorrectly. But until we have enough facts, we're not obliged to entertain simply rosy picture of what the Brotherhood future is. And as far as that's concerned, what we still have is what its pronouncements historically have been. And I don't mean only the ancient pronouncements of Hudson al-Banna, which everyone now says one should dispense with. Its most recent thoughts on politics, which were contained in a draft agenda it published in 2007. In that agenda, it went around some of the issues that were raised by this gentleman here, including the question of what was the status of clerical rule. It declared on one page that there was no clerical rule. It was opposed to clergy. It declared on the next page that Islamic law was a source of authority. And on the third page, I'm exaggerating here a little bit, it explained who the authority for Islamic law is, and it is fuqaha. So, I mean, clerics. So, at the minimum, it presents an extremely confused and self-contradictory view of what its program for the country is. Now, again, one could argue that was in 2007. It was before anyone even thought of the present circumstances. And it may be undergoing changes through the dynamic of the revolution. And revolutions have that capacity. They have this profound capacity to not only change the countries, but to change the groups that are involved in the revolution. But what change results from that is hardly predictable. Maybe it's the positive change that you describe as the hopeful positive change that you describe. It could equally be some other and less positive change. In fact, there could even be a kind of move to a more radical position, more radical than the Brotherhood is at present. So it's just premature.
Okay. Hello.
Can I also, I just wanted to interject a comment here. I think this is, we have this extraordinary debate going on right now in trying to decide, is the U.S. going to interact with the Brotherhood? How do we define the Brotherhood? How many Brotherhoods are there? And defining Islamism. And again, I feel like we're missing the point. Like, why are we not dealing with the people that we know are not the Brotherhood? So people that share our values. Like, why are we not trying to try to come to approach foreign policy with supporting people that share our values? And we did this during communism, apparently. Of course, I'm too young to have known that, but that's what they tell me. But why don't we start having discussions about
We're all too young to know that.
having discussions about supporting people that share our values? And I think as a consequence, and I'm sure Ed does this as well, I mean, traveling around the world with Muslim majority countries for the past 18 years, I've done this as a profession, I see the slide of Muslim communities, the social engineering of Muslim communities. It's not something you see on the news. It's not something you may see talking when it's government to government, but these communities are feeling like they are being Islamicized. And I'm talking about, I wear a head cover, so I'm talking about people that want to practice Islam, that are practicing Muslims, but feel they're being forcefully Islamicized by these political parties. And they want to express themselves. They want free countries. They want their children to choose between being religiously conservative and being secular. They want their countries to prosper without, I'll tell you a very important point. In Malaysia right now, there is a very heated debate because that country is also being Islamicized. There's a very heated debate about Muslims not wanting to commit to the inheritance law of Muslims, because the way Malaysian society is designed, Muslims have to succumb to the Sharia laws of the country, and then non-Muslims get secular laws. So the Muslims are saying, we don't want our inheritance law determined by Sharia. We want to follow the civil system. They say, well, you're not allowed to. So all these issues, there's raids going on in bars, taking Muslim kids out and beating them because they chose to drink. But Muslims around the world don't want to be forced to practice. They want to choose to practice. And this is something we should, as a country that respects religious freedom, should be hoping to encourage in these societies. And so what I'm asking is, instead of focusing on what we don't like, instead focus on what we do like.
Okay, going to the back of the room on this side then. And I'm going to ask you to keep your question short, and again, to speak right into the microphone.
Thank you. Ron Siddiqui from Voice of America. Dr. Miramati, how successful do you think the United States has been in terms of dealing with the current Islamist regime? And do you think it's kind of it looks kind of duplicitous when the U.S. supports Saudi Arabia, when Muslims in other parts of the country, other parts of the world see that, they kind of take a step back or figure out what's going on. And Ed, what kind of network does the Brotherhood have in UK?
I don't think it's, I think the debate to me, again, is not government to government contacts. I think it's reasonable for every country to decide that there are going to be important government to government contacts. But what I'm concerned is about what we do with our civil society funding and what we do with our outreach and what we do with our public diplomacy to try to reach people that share our values. So a lot of people feel that our this tactic support of the way Saudi rules its people and what they do, what they export to the United States and around the world is unacceptable, and that we've done nothing to stop it. So, I mean, that's a problem writ large across the world, where people see this relationship between the United States and Saudis and say, you know, look at what they're exporting that's so anti-Western, anti-Semitic. Why don't you do something to stop it? So, from what I see, it seems to be quite a problem in that respect.
On the question of the Brotherhood's network in the UK, I want to say something general at first, and with all respect to Hilal, and that's that somehow the Jamaat-e-Islami of the Indian subcontinent is the sister organization of the Muslim Brotherhood. It was only a few weeks ago when I had the chance of reading Hassan al-Hudaybi, the second general guide of the Brotherhood, who wrote a book in the 1960s criticizing Sayyid Qutb, the radical wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in that book, Hassan Hudaybi goes out of his way to repeatedly name and shame and criticize Maududi, the founder of Jamaat-e-Islami in the Indian subcontinent. Now, those of us who were born and raised in Britain, or in Europe by extension, one of the things that happened was, in our eyes, the Muslim Brotherhood and the Jamaat-e-Islami were one and the same thing, and they're all part of the Islamic movement. And so my response to you, more or less, is to do with how powerful the Islamic movement is within the UK. And I'd say the Islamic movement has considerable support among Muslims on university campuses. It's difficult, I think, for Muslims to go to university campuses in Britain and interact, say, with the prayer room or with the Islamic society, and not come out with the kind of influence that Hadia spoke about. In other words, greater political Islamization of their mindset. So that's a real problem on campuses. A second network that they have is with the far left in Britain. I think it's a shameful alliance, but it's there nonetheless, that the far left, the Communist and the Socialist Workers' Party and others have more or less aligned with the Islamists in Britain on the grounds that they're all anti-American and anti-Israel and so on. And the last point I'd make, and this is relevant not just to the UK, but I think also in Egypt, that the Muslim Brotherhood and Jamaat-e-Islami networks in the UK have been schismatic over the last 5 years. There's been various breakups, and I anticipate that in Egypt we will see breakups of the Brotherhood. Indeed, we've seen it with Abdul Munim Abdul Fattuh. Last Sunday, he's announced his own political party already, the liberal wing of the Brotherhood. So I think it's an indication of what happened in the UK in terms of inside the organization will also manifest in Egypt itself.
Okay, I guess we should have a panel just on the Muslim Brotherhood in the UK, and anybody's interested in that, I want to put in a plug for Ed's book, The Islamist, because he really gives an inside view of that. This gentleman over here.
Richard Hellman from CPAC and Merkel. I would ask what indications are there of the Muslim Brotherhood's views of the revolution struggle in Libya, how might they or Egypt empower or enable the revolutionaries, and what would the U.S. stake be in that? Or perhaps some of you know what the U.S. stake already in that in our latest war.
I can only say that when I was there all of last week, there were flags. Egyptians have a newfound fervor in their flag. It's being sold everywhere, unparalleled in terms of happening before. But they now feel the country is theirs again. And side by side with the Egyptian flags, all around Cairo at least, the old Libyan flag is also being sold. So that's an indication, I think, of some kind of comradeship between both countries. They are, after all, neighbors. The Muslim Brotherhood stance on this. I'm not a spokesperson for the Muslim Brotherhood, so despite allegations from anyway, so, I am supposed to be a critic.
We thought you changed.
No, but that said, a realist as opposed to anyway. I don't want to define it as opposed to what, but anyway. The Brotherhood stance on this, from what I gather from what the interactions I've had, is no different from the stance of ordinary Egyptians who see Gaddafi broadly as a negative force and ought to be overthrown and something better put in its place.
I think it's just simply fair to say that Gaddafi has not now and rarely has had many fans anywhere in the Muslim world, but he certainly doesn't have any much at present. Though one can see that people are ambivalent about actually using force. I mean, within the region, there are people ambivalent about using force to get rid of him.
In the very back of the room here.
Ira Strauss, Democracy International. I think it's been a fascinating debate. I'm sorry to ignore the third person who's also had important things to say, but I think the debate between Ed and Hillel is very important because it's the crux of what we're about. So I have a question for both. Ed, I hear you telling us that there are so many diverse trees. How can anyone be so crude as to see a forest? And I've heard that in the media many times also. But you did identify a forest. You said Islamism is an anti-Western movement. You dismissed it as a protest movement, but you called it anti-Western. That to me is a forest. That's the crux of what it's about. All the diverse trees are part of a forest, and it's our job to keep the relation of those clear, not to look down on the American people and say, God, they're crude, they see a forest. None of your criteria dealt with that forest. They only dealt with criteria among trees. How do you deal with the forest? How would the rise of Islamism in Egypt affect its rise throughout the Middle East? How would that affect the future of oil in the world and the future of nuclear weapons and some other matters, since Islamism wants to overcome the Western dominance of the world that has existed since Christendom surpassed Islamdom half a millennium ago? It seems to me you need to come up with intellectual criteria for ourselves to deal with that rather than litmus tests for Islamists. My question for Hillel is, if this is a much broader challenge than just some local criteria to be applied, is it adequate to say, well, we can't do much except help a few nice liberals who we don't expect to succeed anyway? Shouldn't we change our goal? Shouldn't we go back to your initial questions? Do we really want to be promoting full-fledged democracy? Or should we be promoting controlled or limited democracy as exists in Germany since 1945, where the dirty secret is Hitler killed off the communists for us and we suppressed the Nazis? That's what enables the controlled democracy of Germany to work. The uncontrolled democracy of Weimar era failed for the same essential reason. In Egypt's case and in the Middle East, wouldn't this mean that we stop trying to disenfranchise and destroy the moderate parties representing the former authoritarian regimes and stop promoting the full enfranchisement of the Islamists?
Okay. A short question there.
Yeah, I'll try and provide a short answer. On this issue of anti-Westernism, and if we sort of specify it more to anti-Americanism, okay, fair enough, let's stick with anti-Westernism. I find anti-Westernism prevalent in Western capitals too. It's not limited to the Muslim Brotherhood. Yes, hammer the Brotherhood for the deserving idiosyncrasies that they have, but let's not, hammer them for all the wrong reasons. You find it in Athens, you find it in Barcelona, you find it in Rome. You speak about the great, Christendom. You see it in Rome, in Mediterranean countries, it's prevalent. In China, you find it. In Russia, you find it. So, anti-Westernism is a fact of life that we need to get used to, because whichever empire in the world exists, whether it was the Ottomans or them before it or the Romans, it's part and parcel of being a superpower, part and parcel of being a world power, that you have those who rival you, and they have sentiments that are against you. And that's just the way the world is. That's been like that since Greek times, Roman times, Persian times, Arab times, and in our time too. And it's just the ugly nature of the world. Now, once that manifests in violence and conflict and trying to undermine the dominance of any given power through unpeaceful or violent means, that's when it becomes a problem. But my contention is that it's part and parcel of being a superpower that we will face that kind of blowback, whether it's intellectual or otherwise. It's when it manifests itself in espionage and other ways that seek to actively undermine it that then it becomes a problem. And on that front, I'd say this, that despite the propaganda, and I've lived in Saudi Arabia and Syria, and I'm a regular visitor to Egypt, among other countries, one of the most amazing things you see in those countries, that people, young people, wear baseball caps. The lines and queues outside Starbucks and McDonald's are exceptionally long. The queues to come into Western capitals, not just American capitals, but European capitals to come and study are regular. The desire to buy American movies and to watch American movies and DVDs and others are widespread. The American sort of supermarket obsession and malls on the increase across the Arab world. So therefore, to say that anti-Westernism is prevalent across the Arab world isn't accurate. There's a love and desire, I think, for Western culture, Western intellectual thought, etc. And the entire Tahrir Square revolution was based on universal ideas of freedom and transparency and democracy. But there are reservations, deep reservations, about American and by extension Western foreign policy. And that's to do with the kind of issues that you touched on. And the challenge is, and that's why I'm optimistic that we can try and fix some of the imbalances in the Muslim Brotherhood and others to try and address the foreign policy injustices that they often accuse us of. And it's in that hope I say that the future picture is mixed, and what we do today, I think, will impact what happens tomorrow.
Let me say, first of all, that I accept the translation of my, at least part of my point with Ed, into forests and trees. I think that's a good way of putting it. But as to your particular question, look, it's in a way too broad because so many countries in the region are in turmoil now, and each one presents different issues. Let me just speak to the question of Egypt for the moment. If it's the case that the next government, and by the way, we still don't know what the form of that government will be, should be dominated by the Muslim Brotherhood, either directly through a majority in the parliament or indirectly, rather like, say, Hezbollah dominates Lebanon at the moment with a minority status. When it's safe to say that Egypt as a country will be less hospitable to American interests. And at a minimum, it will be move closer to countries that are either directly adversaries of the United States, like Iran, or tacitly ones at the moment, like the Republic of Turkey. But it's not clear what we can do to affect that outcome. What makes the situation in Egypt, it seems to me, extremely complicated is the following: that you have actually two large forces, and maybe a half in the country at the moment. One is the Brotherhood, one is the remnants of the National Democratic Party, Mubarak's party, and the other is the military. Now, so far as one can tell, over the last days or weeks, there has come to be a tacit understanding between the army and the Brotherhood that they will work together in some fashion over the next few months. That's the situation which will obtain for the near term. I think it's fair to say, until there is actually an election. Until when the election occurs, there will be presumably a call for rewriting the Constitution. That was presumably what, in fact, the reason why the Brotherhood fought so hard over the referendum this weekend. That's essentially what they said in their propaganda, and the unfair part of their propaganda was namely that if you didn't vote for this, you were voting for a country, I forgot what it is, where women wouldn't have, the hijab would be banned, the call to prayer would be banned, and men and women would be allowed to marry one another. That was going to all that was going to happen if the referendum didn't pass. What did that really mean? It really meant that there would not be, I think, a progress towards the elections, which will elect an assembly, which will write a new constitution, presumably. So that's going to be it looks like what's going to happen over the next few months. There'll be progress towards those elections, and cooperation between the army and the Brotherhood towards that end. What happens after that, I don't know, and there may then be opportunities for American policy to guide and shape what happens in Egypt.
Okay, let's move up this thought. Right here.
My name is Kami, but I write for the Pakistani Spectator. My question is to Dr. Hadia. So, according to my observation, when U.S. try to help those secular forces, we make, as a matter of fact, stronger to Islamic anti-American forces there, because those people think, oh, these people are supported by America, so they are kind of evil. So we basically unite them. It has opposite consequences what we want to gain. Otherwise, for example, Maulana Mabudi, his children got education from there. Then Fazlul Haq, with the current Amir of in Pakistan, his children got education there. I think if we try to stay away from their domestic politics and not try to fund one group, probably we would be better off. For example, this Mr. 10%, he gave a speech like just a couple of days ago, and I'm sure it was written by Mark Siegel. And he was trying to impress American. He was not trying to impress Pakistani, because he gave this speech in England.
Which Mr. 10%?
Pakistani president.
Erdogan's also known as Mr.
So I
10%.
agree
I
with
want
that.
to know which one you're referring to.
I agree with Dr. President. We should just, give them break and live with whoever they select. Because when these people Islamists come into power, like Fazlul Haq in Pakistan, they make a lot of mistakes. First of all, they cannot come into power if we leave them alone, because they are never elected. They are always elected by the dictator who are supported by us. For example, General Musharraf, he was the one who made those Islamists to come into power and end WFP. Otherwise, they never won more than 4 or 5% of the total seats. So I agree with Dr. Franklin. We should just leave them alone. Thanks.
I think I'd also like to, in reference to your comment and the other gentleman's comment, I personally have a view, though there are 100 different shades of the rise of political Islam in the Muslim world, and I'm saying the Muslim world on purpose rather than Muslim majority countries, but I think the United States is going to have to develop a policy on how we deal with political Islam. I think it doesn't matter what country it's in, we need to come to terms with the fact that this is changing the shape of Muslim minds wherever they may be. So I don't think we're going to stop. I don't think we're going to stop funding IRI and NDI and NED, and all these institutions exist. We have democracy promotion programs, and this is part of what America does. So all I'm saying is, well, you have all these resources, you have the mechanism, try to give power and voice to people that share our values. And I'm not just talking about secularists, I'm talking about all different kinds of progressive groups, culturally Muslim groups. I don't care what they are, but there are other groups out there, there are other people there, and they're not destined to fail. They are the majority of these countries. We've all said before, the Islamists aren't the majority. So you're telling me we don't have a way to empower the majority? I just don't believe that that's true. But I do think the United States needs to come to terms with the rise of political Islam, and we need to decide what we're going to do about it.
Can I ask Hedja this question? Because I don't disagree with the notion that if we can do something, we should try to do something. But I think this man's question and your own remarks earlier testify to the fact that we have often not known what we were doing, though we did think we were. And to take the case of most recent developments in Pakistan, about 2 years ago, a lot of people looked to the lawyers' union as a source of support for progress on the Democratic and Liberal front because of their very brave fight against Musharraf, or support for the Supreme Court in its fight against Musharraf. That was impressive. They seemed to be people who were in favor of rule of law and were willing to stand up to even the military to do so. Unfortunately, many of the same people recently cheered the murder of
Taseer. Governor of Punjab.
What are we to make of those? How do we parse those situations?
That particular example, I do a lot of work in Pakistan, so that particular example is very troubling because I know a lot of the people that we discussed about the ASJ, the Al Sunnah wal Jamaat groups, and the Sufi groups in Pakistan, the Brailwi groups also did not. They signed that condemnation of, the support of the murder of Salman Taseer, and that goes into a very complicated issue about religious law and blasphemy law. So, two things: the issue of blasphemy law and its sacredness to traditional Muslims is part of the problem, and two, the rising tide. They felt, and the scholars I spoke to, some of whom were signatories, said, if we didn't sign, we are already fighting the Taliban on one front, and they're constantly murdering our students in our community. And if we open a second front with these other groups, with these very conservative groups on the other side, we will have opened a war on two fronts. And we just can't afford to do that right now. We can't afford to have no friends. And so they had to go with the rising tide, and that's unfortunate. But I'm not saying that these other groups are fail-proof. I mean, they're 30 years behind the Islamists in terms of organization and messaging and designing their programs around a particular ideology. So they're definitely not perfect, but there are some foundational principles in which we have in common that I think we should foster with them.
And I think that one of the things that, Hedia, you brought up in Afghanistan and I saw in Iraq was that actually we were affirmatively funding
we were doing it.
The Islamists.
Right.
So that the Iranian-influenced groups in Iran received the benefit of our training on how to get out the vote. To me, that seems very counterproductive to our own pursuit of our interests. And back there again.
My name is Stephen Cull from the Program on International Policy Attitudes. We do a lot of polls and focus groups in Egypt. The idea that Egypt is divided into Islamist and secular groups really doesn't hold up. It's true that a large majority of Egyptians do support liberal ideas, democracy, and so on, but 3/4 also support the idea that the laws should be vetted by Islamist scholars as to whether they're consistent with Sharia. Majorities want to see Sharia play a large role in Egypt. And there's also consensus that the U.S. is hostile to Islam. And I do agree with the previous questioner that if we were to differentially support secular groups, clearly not support Islamist groups, this would play to the advantage of the Muslim, and it would be a way to kind of affirm their position as defending Islam against the efforts of the United States to destroy Islam, which is a very large majority view in Egypt. So I don't really see how you can pursue that differential support without producing something back.
I'd just like to clarify again, I thought I did after the last comment. I absolutely am not dividing it into secular and liberals. I mean, secular and Islamists. That's my whole point, that the majority of the Egyptian people are not just secularists. It's not just the secularists and the Islamists. There is a whole body of traditional Muslims that range from very liberal to very conservative, but consider themselves mainstream Sunni and Shias. They're just not part of the political Islamic framework. So they do have varying degrees of interest in Sharia, but they don't have the global expansionist methodology of political Islam. They're Egyptians, and they just happen to have varying degrees of religiosity, but their faith doesn't dictate their political aspirations. They're just people who practice a particular faith. So I absolutely am not saying they're just secularists and Islamists.
Okay, this gentleman here.
Dan Pollock with the Zionist Organization of America. I had a very specific question and a kind of a more general one. Specifically, if the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood has a big role in the Egyptian government, I don't think the near-term danger is so much that they'll do away with the peace agreement, but kind of gradually erode the progress there, particularly introduce more forces, for example, into Sinai, cut back on the amount of oil that Israel has sold, natural gas. What steps can the United States take, given the, I think, presumption that we're going to want to continue to support the movement toward democracy that's going to be pretty popular in the near term, if those steps actually start to be taken, if they introduce, for example, additional military units in the Sinai in the name of containing, Bedouin activity that is pro-Hamas, something that the United States would necessarily be opposed to. That's the specific question. The more general one is really for Ed about, I'm sure you're a student of other revolutions in world history. Can you distinguish between what you say is a positive step, that there's intellectual discussion within the Muslim Brotherhood, from the Iranian Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution? All of these revolutions were characterized by a diversity of opinion, and then ultimately with, for want of a better word, the bad guys taking over at the end.
The American Revolution?
Say again?
The American Revolution.
The American Revolution, with the good guys taking over at the end. Thank you.
Yeah, so I rest my case. I rest my case.
The diversity of opinion doesn't automatically.
True. That's why it's all up for grabs. That's why what we do today determines what happens tomorrow.
Well, it was up to some degree for grabs in our revolution as well, and we were extremely fortunate in having extremely able leaders, particularly Washington and Adams. But that's always the question: who will emerge in the scene? And so far, it's not really clear in Egypt whether established figures are going to be the most important as one goes forward, or is this going to be someone altogether new, or someone known but who is not formally considered to be part of the political scene. For example, Amr Khalid, who is a very well-known television and popular preacher who has announced he's going to establish his own party. Now, it may succeed, but one's still at a loss to know what he will do. So, as for the question of Israel and Egypt and so forth, first of all, the introduction of more troops into Sinai would be a violation of the treaty. Israel is, on the request of the Egyptian government, permitted additional troops to enter the Sinai to deal with the chaos that occurred there after the rule started. I guess, what would we do? I mean, the problem with those issues is, presumably if various things happen, there'll be discussions among the Israelis, the United States, and the Egyptians, and so forth, all, I presume, urging restraint and all hoping for restraint, precisely because any one of these things can actually lead ultimately to the outbreak of war without actually even in a formal abrogation of the treaty. I think that's what probably is the real danger, as you implied, not the wholesale abrogation of the treaty, but some kind of crisis, which perhaps caused by Hamas or some other party along the the Israeli Gazan border or the Israeli-Egyptian border, which gets out of control.
Okay, there's a gentleman in the middle here. Set a hand up.
Hi, I'm Colin Foussard from the French airport, and I'm working as an exchange officer in the Pentagon right now. I would like to come back on a question that has, for me, not been answered totally about Libya. As you guess, it's quite a concern right now at the Pentagon. There's as well a prospect there that an Islamist government take place. Do you think, I would like to know what these rebels are exactly, even though I know there's not one rebel, there's probably a huge community of rebels. What are their links with the Muslim Brotherhood? And as the Western powers right now are quite promoting and clearly promoting these rebels, do you think that they can offer an alternative that is favorable to Western societies in the future?
You want to say something about that, or should I? Well, as you stated, not a lot is known about composition of the rebels in Benghazi. In fact, there's undoubtedly a variety of groups. The Brotherhood itself is unlikely to be a major component at the moment, just because it was very hard for a group like the Brotherhood to survive under the Gaddafi regime. What did survive, were Al-Qaeda type groups, and even they didn't survive all that well. So it may be that if it's the case that either Gaddafi goes or that at least that there's a stalemate, so that there comes to be a kind of an Eastern Libya as a kind of separate entity at the moment. It's probable that all kinds of groups will in the short term flourish, and I presume that there would be at least some elements within the Egyptian and the Tunisian Brotherhood that would want to provide assistance to groups that they were friendly with in the past. How big an effort that would prove to be and how successful it would be is really very unpredictable at the moment. And altogether, it depends on there actually being an Eastern Libya. At the moment, that seems to rest largely in the hands of the French Air Force. So.
Yes.
Which leads me to say, what are you doing here? No.
My name is Gideon Mold. I'm a US Pacific work. My question is for Mr. Hussein. Thank you for the presentation. I'm specifically interested in the question that it was saying, to what extent in your meetings with members of the Muslim Brotherhood, they're looking over their shoulder, or they're more worried they were to Bahrain, where they would be outflanked. Yes, that also involves a little bit to what extent decisions for those particularly extreme groups that they may.
I think that's an excellent question, and that's the question that we should be asking, because that implies that the Muslim Brotherhood isn't by far the most extreme organization out there, and that's part of the problem of the discourse here.
Could you rephrase the question, because some people had trouble hearing.
You want to do that?
No, you go ahead.
Okay, I think the question was, is the Muslim Brotherhood concerned about groups that are extremists or more extreme? And, what are their thoughts on that? I asked this question to every single person of the Brotherhood I met, and it was the last question I asked, that are you concerned about the rise of Al-Qaeda, affiliated organizations, terrorists, jihadists, and others emerging in a new Egypt, as they emerged in the new Iraq, as they emerged elsewhere, in Pakistan more recently. And repeatedly, and this is something that worried me, and I'm penning a piece for a major magazine here, and I'm going to bring this issue out, that repeatedly every single member of the Brotherhood came out and said, no, in a free Egypt, there's no problem, because all of these groups, the jihadis and the takfiris, previously, they were dedicated to overthrowing Hosni Mubarak. That's now done. There's no reason for them to come and operate. Now, that kind of naive understanding of the threat from jihadism worried me, because the Muslim Brotherhood activists for too long had been obsessed with the current regime, as opposed to those who are on the right wing or further along on the right wing of the Muslim Brotherhood. Point one. Point two is that whether it's the prisoners who broke out during the revolution, or whether subsequently Anwar Sadat's assassins, and even Ayman al-Zawahiri's brother was released and subsequently re-arrested and imprisoned over the course of the last week. Other jihadis have been released from prison in Egypt. Al-Qaeda operatives from Ayman al-Zawahiri's organization have been released from prison in Egypt. They've gathered in Asyut, and they've also gathered in other parts of Egypt. And when asked, they've gone out of the way to say, oh, we've abandoned violence, but we believe in our previous principles. And so how do you square a key component of your ideology, violence, which was your previous principle, and now jettison it? That's saying we're non-violent, violent extremists. So I think that's the real area of concern, that where is the right wing, on those on the right of the Muslim Brotherhood, where are they going to come from? And therefore, as one member of the Brotherhood said to me, and I think he put it very well, the Muslim Brotherhood is a headache, but it's not a cancer. The cancer's elsewhere.
Here, back.
My name is Lee Tucker, and I'm with the Public International Law and Policy Group. And my question is actually kind of related to the last question, but on the other side of the spectrum. The 77% yes vote on the referendum, a lot of people have been interpreting as overwhelming support for the Brotherhood and its agenda. But some of the people that our group has been talking to, especially in the youth movement and people on the ground, have suggested that, in fact, a lot of people came out and voted yes for two reasons, one of which is that the yes vote actually provided a clear path forward, and that the no would have left them without any kind of pathway. You know, the yes vote provided a clear option forward and some clear steps. And the other reason is that the vote yes actually represented a real change and a way for them to get out there and do something and actually affect that change. And so that maybe using that vote as an indicator of the Brotherhood's real influence is not really accurate, and that perhaps the Brotherhood is exaggerating the actual power and influence that it does have.
I guess I'll offer an opinion about that, and Ed can as well if he likes it. I think there's no question that lots of people voted for it, for at least one of the reasons you stated, which was that they wanted a sense that there's actually a way forward. And what they were in particular afraid of is, I think, that if there wasn't movement forward, everything would just sort of continue to be up in the air. That, in fact, a lot of people in Egypt are ready or desirous of things calming down a little bit. But, so that's, I think, true. I think it remains the case that a very substantial number of the vote for it was delivered by the Muslim Brotherhood, and that, at least in the short term, it does serve their interests to have been seen to be very much for it, and for the referendum to have passed, because that does give people an impression that they are very influential. Maybe it gives an impression that's exaggerated, but it's not simply nothing. But it's separate, I think, from the question of the vote itself. The vote itself was important to show that a vote could happen. I mean, that I think was in its way a positive thing for the country, just in the same way as when sawn away the pride that people took in having been able to vote in a really free election, just as they did, for example, in Iraq with the same symbol, the thumb color. The, the difficulty, it seems to me, more generally though, is that going forward, as I said before, it seems to me that there's a kind of tacit agreement now between the army and the Brotherhood about going forward. Now, what's the point of that on the Brotherhood side? I suspect, because I'm disinclined to think that they want to run the government straight out in the short term, even if I'm right and Ed's wrong about what their intentions are. But I do think they do want to be sure that they control the process of the drafting of the Constitution, the new Constitution. So this was important to them. On the Army side, the Army plainly does not want to run things on a day-to-day basis. They were happy with the old system, not because Mubarak was in charge particularly, but because they were influential, they were respected, they were wealthy, and they didn't have to do any of the dirty work of governance. Now they see the prospect of them having to do the dirty work of governance, which means, among other things, earning the losing some of the respect that they have heretofore from the public. So they would like the politicians to earn that disrespect, not them. But the question is, down the road, how, those, right now there's a somewhat of a convergence between the interests of the Brotherhood and the Army. That it's hard to see how those interests will stay convergent in the future, and that will lead to some kind of conflicts and tensions. It's really hard to understand how those will, to know what they'll be, let alone how they'll be resolved. The one, which makes one remark that the Brotherhood people make all the time seem rather significant, and that is the respect shown for the Turkish model, i.e. the AKP model, which is a model of how an Islamist party would deal with a recalcitrant military. So,
Did you have a question? You'll get the last question then.
Abe Shulsky here at Hudson. Actually, the point I wanted to raise is the point that Hillel was just getting to, which is what do we make of this sort of seeming alliance between the Brotherhood and the Army? I mean, they certainly have enough history between them that would be very negative. And in particular, I guess I wanted to ask Ed whether, when he talked to people in the Brotherhood, did he get any sense of whether this had been a controversial sort of matter within the Brotherhood? I mean, after all, here they are cooperating rather closely with an army, very impressive for years. You would think they would have lots and lots of grievances, and yet, together quite well. So I was just wondering if you had any sense of how that came about, that top-down perspective. Hey, where did that come from?
I don't have specific information as to how that materialized, other than picking up on the dynamics of the relationship at the moment. With the exception of the crowd that's regularly in Tahrir Square at the moment, most people in Egypt seem to have a veneration for the army for the very right reasons. It seems to me that the army didn't open fire on protesters, and it's that old relationship that's continued. That's point one. Point two is people like Muhammad al-Baltaji, Muhammad al-Shahawi and others from the Muslim Brotherhood were there from day one. And it's true that the rest of the Brotherhood joined on the 28th of January, but on the 25th of Jan, when the protest started, these people were there from day one, and they had a relationship of sort of supporting and policing and manning the protests, and as a result they built up a relationship of trust with the army. That's not to say that relationship will last. It's very fragile. I'll end with this anecdote. When I was in Tahrir Square last Friday for Friday prayers, after the prayers there was a protest meeting there, and I that I observed, and one of the military leaders, well decorated, got up on stage, and everybody fell silent, which is the normal tradition at Tahrir Square. When a military person goes out, everyone sort of is silent in veneration and support of the military. When this particular person got up and said, look, we the army are with you, the people, for the first time in the entire sort of, what is it now, 2 months and a bit history of Tahrir Square, everyone in the crowd started shouting Inzil, 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 which means get down, or get off, get off. That was the first time that emerging sort of animosity with the army was beginning to show, but that was with the no campaign, people who were against the referendum. So it's on the other side, which will then lead, I think, the army, if this is an expression of wider sentiment, to lean more towards not just the Muslim Brotherhood. Don't forget the NDP also supported the amendments, the old Hosni Mubarak regime, which has deeper ties to the army for obvious reasons.
The only thing I would add to what Ed said, Abe, is the brother had a more convenient first object of animosity, and that was the internal police, who were really the most direct instruments of their repression. So it was in a way easier for them to give a pass to the army.
I invite everyone to take a copy of the Current Trends magazine at the back of the room that is put out by Hillel and Hudson. I want to thank you all for coming, and I particularly want to thank our panelists.